most obvious one, remain hidden. The economic exploitation of Crete provided the research to create such beauty. Every palace, historical family, and street corners preserves a trace of cultural interaction. Yet in the present stage of cultural homogenization, the traces of Crete are not easy to identify. They are absorbed in the urban environment. But just as our DNA determines our genetic heritage, Crete's presence in Venice is very really nonetheless. We have to search for it, but once we start searching, we find Crete everywhere. My paper aims to bring to your attention things that bear witness to the presence of Crete in Venice, like pieces in a mosaic that is still decipherable. It is a reflection on the project on which I am carrying out with my students as a support of their studies of modern Greek language and culture. There is an enormous volume of scholarly work on the relations between Venice and Crete in the period of Venetian rule. The Venetian presence on Crete has been widely discussed, but the Cretan presence in Venice far less so. In part, the reasons are obvious. In a capital city, the provinces always have a subaltern role. Yet, in the flow of culture of Crete to Venice was significant for the cultural history of the Serenissima. It is traceable not just in architectural monuments, but also in literature, visual art, music, and religion. The evidence it is useful not just for identifying the traces left by Crete in Venice, but also for reconstructing the ideology behind the power that Venice exercised in her overseas possessions. In my paper, I will focus mainly on Cretan imports, both material and in form of ideology and culture. I will aim to examine the present of Crete through places, names, objects, and myths, both during the period of Venetian domination and more recently. Obviously, it will not be possible to give a complete picture. There has been a great deal of research on the role of Crete after 1453 in the preservation and reproduction of classical manuscripts. After the fall of Mistra, Crete remained for a long time the only source of Greek cultural production in the Levant. It was the birthplace of scholars such as Marco Musuro, man's attitude to cultural aspiration of Western intellectual in the age of humanism. From the beginning of their occupation of Crete in the early 13th century, the Venetians integrated and added to the wealth of the island in the intellectual as well as material terms, giving many opportunities to develop careers in Venice. Of course, relations were not always idyllic, and many bloodily suppressed Cretan revolts, but overall that remains in the memory is a generally peaceful coexistence. Generally, Venice is a kind of real life PowerPoint. The city possesses a rich patrimony of Greek statues, architectural fragments, and manuscripts, and probably no other city had integrated, reworked, and assimilated such artifacts so thoroughly. The city is an open-air museum designed to convey a vision of power and wisdom. Even when looking at a place that's not particularly edifying, such as the casino, we can see the casino, yes. We can meditate on some aspects of the interrelation between Venice and Crete. I might use this image to talk about the poem Apokopos, because this palace, Apokopos, is Palazzo Vendramin Calliergi. It's a Cretan family on the Grand Canal. So I use this image when I want to talk about this, the importance of this family with my students. So I can use this image to talk about Nicolaus Cagliergi or Zacharias Cagliergi, his father, who was one of the most cultivated copists and editors of classical texts in the late 15th or early 16th century. I might go back further in time to discuss the revolt against Venetians organized in the 13th century by the Cagliergi's clan. Its outcomes were commented on by Petrarca. He describes the just held in San Marco to celebrate the victory over the Cagliergi rebels in Crete. I might speak about Antonio Cagliergi, a scholar who amassed an extensive collection of books in 16th century Crete, and also about Antonio Pandimo, the Cretan who wrote his Amorosa Fede in Italian for the wedding of Cagliergi, the next one, printed in Venice in 1620. The names of the various Cagliergi show how the histories of Crete and Venice come together in this palace. Nikos Panagiotakis, that unforgettable Cretan who was resident in Venice in the later years of the 20th century, produced in 1968 the article Research in Venice, which is still a fundamental article. By researching among Veneto-Cretan manuscripts, many of them discovered by him in Venetian archives and libraries, he provides a precious source of documentation on the Cagliergi and a mine of bibliographical reference. We might instead begin to decipher the facade of the palazzi and churches in order to make our discussion on Venetian Crete immediately accessible. So we can see the other slides with the state archives and merchant library. Yes, that's merchant library. And the other one with the Batrachomymakia 1486. That's it. The editors of the Pseudo-America Batrachomymakia, which appear in print in 1486, were also Cretans. Alexandros Georgios and Leonikos Cretensis were Cretan, like most copies of ancient texts active in the end of the 15th century and the beginning of the 16th. These manuscripts made it possible for Westerns to satisfy their interest in ancient literature. From Crete come also the vast majority of the works of sculpture forming the nucleus of the first collection of antiquities, which continued to develop through their life. More than 4 centuries of uninterrupted contact cannot have left traces in the province alone. In Venice, too, contact with Crete determined the rise and establishment of a specific taste and a particular sensibility. Thanks to the presence of Venetians on Crete, there developed a strong interest in ancient art and its history, especially ancient sculpture. This determined the shape of the first collection of antiquities, such as the prestigious ones created by the Grimani or by Federico Contarini, now held in the Venice Archaeological Museum on Piazza San Marco. In Piazza San Marco, the basilica is striking. I want to add to our Venetian mosaic just one small but not insignificant piece. The artist, Nikolaos Philanthropinos, was perhaps a native of Constantinople, but he had lived in Candia and then he was resident in Venice in 1430. He was recorded, the next one, as Magister Artis Mosaice in the Basilica. I should also make a brief reference to the extraordinary volume of Venetian cartography maps of Crete. Being a accomplished navigator and explorator, the Venetians took care to reproduce on paper the physical appearance of their Cretan territory. So we can see 3 images now. 1, 2, 3. Historical writing is a fundamental aspect of the Cretan presence in Venice, beginning with Lorenzo the Monaci in 14th century. In the later times, we have endless chronicle on the Cretan wars of 1645 till 1669, produced and published in Venice, such as the famous one by Andrea Valiero. This question reserves more space than even in this overview, but time doesn't allow it. I'd like now to direct your attention to the loggetta designed by Sansovino at the base of the tower bell campanile of San Marco, the next one. And the allegory of Venice, seated between the kingdoms of Cyprus and Crete, has been the subject of many studies. Though I don't know how many of the millions of visitors appreciate its ideological message. To the vast bibliography, we can now add the recent study of Alfred Vincent in the last issue of Campus, which begins with a glance at the ideology of power portrayed in these bas reliefs. The second one, the other one. This is Crete on the bas relief. But I cannot leave the piazza without searching of Crete with a few choice monuments inside the Palazzo Ducale. The next one. This is Domenico Robusti, Tintoretto Son, Allegory of Crete. You can see Crete and the other. This Crete with the labyrinto on his head, and the other one is the door of the Sala dello Scrutinio, the voting hall. This door is dedicated to Francesco Morosini, the commander who in 1669 surrendered Candia to the Ottomans after 20 years of siege. The loss of the island seemed at the time to be a simple temporary disaster, since the same commander succeeded some years later in snatching the Peloponnese from the Ottomans. At the beginning of the 18th century, when Venice no longer had its estates to cultivate in Crete, its merchant vessels to equip, and its professional soldiers to pay to defend its overseas territories, vast accumulated fortunes were spent on palace and celebrations. The brilliant wealth of 18th century decorative art, architecture, and music is owed partly to the fact that the children and the grandchildren of the two post-Candia generations were no longer employed in commercial and military enterprise, and so had a change to enjoy life. Casanova is an example. From the windows of the loggia of Palazzo Ducale, overlooking the harbour basin, we can see the island of San Servolo, the next one, with its monastery. Now the home of Venice International University. This island is another witness to the presence of Crete. In fact, in this place, where Catholic nuns from Crete were settled in seclusion during the years when Venice was losing its grip on Candia, is the place where the nuns. So I cut a lot of things of my paper. Sorry for that, and my English is not so fluent. Looking eastwards from the balcony of the Palazzo Ducale, we can see the majestic dome of Santa Maria della Salute. Yes, the other one. Greatly esteemed in Venice, and also the second. This is this one, and then back this. This icon is greatly esteemed in Venice, with its popular annual feast day on the 21st of November. This icon of Madonna della Salute, Mesopanditis, is perhaps the most tangible link in the chain joining this extraordinary city with Crete. This is not a history of ships, commerce, and power, but also an impalpable story of men and women who had shared centuries of private life. On the other side of the Grand Canal, from the Salute, we find the church of Santa Maria del Giglio. whose 17th century facade is a monument celebrating the power of the Barbaro family. On its lower part, it is a topographical relief showing the fortification of Candia. The next one. In private houses, especially those have not undergone extensive alterations, there are certainly more Cretan treasures yet to be discovered. Just recently, a study has been published on the frescoes dated on the second half of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century, featuring various places in Crete, in Palazzo Berlendis, not the one in Venice, but in Capriolo near Bergamo. This family, not an ancient, Venetian descent, wanted to celebrate through their pictures of Crete the glorious memory of their lineage and its head, Giacomo Berlendis, who in 1571 was superintendent of the fortresses on the island. Music. I can make no more than a mention of the Cretan Franciscus Leondaridis in the 16th century, a contemporary of El Greco and Shakespeare, a choir master at San Marco and a composer of sacred music in Western style. But in 16th century Venice you can also hear the songs and jokes of many soldiers of fortunes, mercenaries of Greek origin in pay of the Serenissima, who were clever and able warriors, but also dashing young men, giving to the wildest kinds of entertainment and as a result of their condition of their life. These soldiers are also the protagonists in literary works, as incarnations of the stereotypes of the boastful soldier Miles Gloriosus, well known from the ancient comedy onwards. They became a model for artists and musicians. Echoes of Cretan and these soldiers you can hear in the Grecesque of Antonio da Molino, who had spent time in Candia. Cretan themes can be found in many Venetian melodramas in the end of 18th century, like the opera, that we can see many titles here. But the myth of Ariadne deserves a special mention. It was continually represented in its many variations on the Venetian stage, starting even before it was taken up by Monteverdi. The abandonment of Ariadne echoes round the Venetian theatre not as a distant, exotic myth, but as the memory of a land once posted and now lost. Theatre test. Only a brief mention to the trace of Cretan in Venetian theatre. In addition to the tragedy Phaedra and the most noble Just at Cagna by Giancarlo Persio, we have some works with Cretan setting or mythological themes with a Cretan connection, which have been little studied until now. Dating the first decade of the 17th century, I found more than 10 theatre dramas set in Crete. Crete was not an exotic and unknown land for them, so we must suppose that this collocation was not a casual and undetermined no land. I only mentioned here the maritime drama The Regia Pescatrice by Giacomo Castoreo, set in Lesbo, who called Methlene, as the author knows. The protagonists, Clotilda and her lover, Tersandro, are noble Cretans who have fled their native land for political reasons and are forced to live disguised as fishers. In 1785, and I'm finishing in a few minutes, when Venice was about to lose her autonomy, Giovanni Pindemonte staged his tragedy, I Coloni di Creta. With his action at the time of Cretan revolt against Venetian rule, The work provoked an uproar. The Greek community in Venice made a successful protest to the Council of Ten to stop the performances. The incident deserves a special mention in this paper because it shows that despite all the process of integration, there was still some lack of understanding between Venetians and Cretans. In reviving an historical incident for the mid-14th century, more than 100 years after the end of Venetian rule in Crete, more was involved than give a simple historical account of the facts. Maybe Pindemonte was transferring a situation relevant to his own times to a distant historical context. Maybe relations with Greek community, which was potentially attracted by Russian imperial propaganda regarding the Mediterranean, had become a problem for the local nobility, which had become aware of its own weakness and now saw foreigners, and especially non-Catholic foreigners, as possible enemies of the states. Although the work was probably never performed again in Venice, it was reprinted frequently. The independent story of Serenissima had now come to an end, where there remain only traces of its ancient glories. But as in the course of the 19th century the situation of the city was transformed, the memory of Crete gradually faded. Athens was the capital of the new Greek kingdom. Crete was not yet part of it, and Venice was no longer a rich land where Greeks could do business. In 1848, in his collection of Venetian popular songs, Domenico del Medico informed us that in Venice at this time the expression "to be Cretan" meant to be broke. By now the relationship between Venice and Crete was quite distant, and the trace of each in the other, though still visible, are being integrated. The Venetian present in Crete has been the subject of research of many decades, and David Holton has been one of its tireless proponents. Studies on Cretan presence in Venice have been much less extensive. It has been difficult for a provincial entity like Crete to make space for itself in the capital, and difficult to attract proper attention in such a variegated context. And yet, without a study on the traces of Crete in Venice, the study on Venetian influence on the island remains incomplete. If we can restore our awareness of history through Venetians' multi-ethnic and multilingual dimension over the centuries, our pact with the future may not be lost. Sorry for my English.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And we have a few minutes for discussion before having coffee. Any questions?
I wanted to ask something about the nuns that were transported to Venice from Crete. Were they the Catholic nuns, right?
Many of them were also Greek names.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, Marietta, Jelena, I have some names, but I cut my paper.
Sure. So there were some of them were
yes.
more of Greek extraction.
Yeah, yes.
The Catholic community on Crete was a big one?
I don't know. It was half and half, but still. You understood that I intentionally don't use any picture, any icons from the Greek part of the town, because it's obvious that you can find a lot of Cretan traces there. So I use just very well-known Venetian icons, and also these Venetian icons immediately are speaking Cretan language.
Any more questions?
Are Venetians today aware of this tradition?